Hi everyone, welcome back to this lecture on syllables and syllabification. We can now turn to an important question, which in fact remains a topic of considerable research among phonologists, namely whether syllables are cognitively real. And given that we're talking about syllables in this lecture, we are departing from the assumption that indeed speakers of languages do tend to organize segments into groups that we are labeling syllables. There are some reasons to think that speakers do have such things as syllables in the phonology of their language. And although it is the case that speakers are often ambivalent about syllable structure, that is, they are not always certain whether a given consonant belongs to one syllable or another syllable, their intuitions about the number of syllables in a word are usually quite reliable. So for instance, when they sing, they can follow quite clearly the number of syllables in a word. So it's not the case typically that speakers have completely different ideas of that a word has 2 syllables, whereas another speaker will have 4 syllables. That's fairly consistent. A more important reason and analytical reason to think that there are such things as syllables is that this sort of rule, given here, is a type of rule that occurs many times over in many, many different languages. And the rule will have the following structure, that some change occurs in the context immediately preceding a consonant or the end of a word. So again, there's some phonological process that takes place either before another consonant or the end of a word, and not before another vowel. And this use of these curly brackets in the notation, that means or, we should always take that to mean that we've not understood something. Namely, if you start listing segments here in between curly brackets, when you are looking for where a rule applies or under what conditions the rule applies, that should indicate to you should look for some kind of natural class. But of course, in terms of phonological features, we can't easily group together a consonant and a word boundary. But we can translate this into terms of syllables. Namely, we could understand this to mean the right edge of a syllable. This would correspond to the environment, consonant, or word boundary. And the fact that this same sort of environment occurs in many rules, in many, many languages, gives a strong indication that we really should think that there is some kind of commonality in this environment of consonant or word boundary, which we can explain as the right edge of a syllable. So in other words, we're saying a segment in the coda of a syllable will be affected in some way. So now that we've seen that we can indicate, for instance, the right edge of a syllable like this, or the left edge of a syllable like this, so that would mean the onset of a syllable, and this would mean the coda here. We can put this into practice in writing a few phonological rules. So let's begin with an example from Korean. In Korean, it's the case that all obstruents become unaspirated and non-tense stops. Korean has some special distinctions in features for stops that are not so common cross-linguistically. And this neutralization of obstruents to unaspirated and non-tenseness occurs when they're in the code of a syllable. So the target for our rule, if we're talking about obstruents, we mean segments that are non-sonorant, and they need to become minus aspirated. Let's look at our feature chart here. We want the Bayesian features. So if we want to find there, we want the feature spread glottis for aspiration. So they need to become minus spread glottis. And we'll use the feature tense here, which normally only applies to vowels, but in this Korean case, we'll assume it applies to consonants as well. And this occurs when a segment is in the coda of a syllable. And we've just said we can use the following notation here to mark the end of a syllable. So and say, oh, if this segment occurs here at the boundary, the right boundary of a syllable, then it will undergo this change. So that could be at the end of the word, or it could be preceding another consonant that belongs to the onset of the following syllable. Similarly, in dialect of Spanish spoken in the Dominican Republic, the coda approximants la and ra undergo lenition, they become weaker, to become a glide when they occur in a coda. So let's try to use some features for the change. In this language, these will be segments that are plus consonantal and plus approximant. So in general, we're going to capture the approximant segments that are not glides or vowels of the language. And these segments will become a glide ya in the same context as the context we've just seen for Korean at the end of a syllable. And in Spanish, here we have this fortition of ya to ya when it occurs in an onset position. See if we can find the relevant segment here. We have this palatal continuant, this palatal fricative, which is created when a glide ya falls in the onset of a syllable. So let's start by adding the environment here, the onset of a syllable. We said that will be the left edge of a syllable at the very beginning of a syllable. So remember that this explains why we don't see this fortition in the Spanish word copia, for instance. In this case, the underlying ya is not at the very beginning of the syllable, rather this pa is at the very beginning of the syllable, and this process of changing the glide ya to ya will not occur. So we can assume we have the input ya, and let's look together for what features change here. So ya, the difference between ya, and there are going to be quite a few differences in terms of features here, namely that this palatal continuant here is non-sonorant, and non-approximant, and it's plus consonantal, whereas the glide should be here somewhere, if I can find it. Should be a fronted, yes, it's here. Remember, a glide, of course, is going to be non-consonantal, but it's plus sonorant, and my zero delayed release and plus approximant. So a number of manner features need to be changed here. It's going to become plus consonantal, minus sonorant, minus continuant remains. It's going to become plus delayed release from having no value for the feature delayed release, and it's going to become minus approximant. So all of those manner features change. I think that the other features here are going to largely remain the same, except it also will also need to become plus coronal, because this is a palatal segment. Yeah, so it needs to become plus coronal and plus distributed for characterizing these palatal segments generally. But the other dorsal and tongue features should remain the same. So there are quite a few feature changes here that take place in changing ya to the palatal voiced fricative ya, ya. Okay, where's that distributed feature? Yeah. Okay, so there's our change, and remember this is occurring at the beginning of a syllable. If you didn't follow all the feature changes here, that's fine. The important thing for today was to notice that this change takes place at the beginning of a syllable. Let's think now about how syllabification could potentially interact a little bit with morphology as well, and what things could change. So assuming that a language has syllabification rules, more or less like English, let's imagine an input, da-bad. And the syllabification that I would expect, of course, we're going to have two syllables, and I would expect one syllable, da, and another syllable, bad, in which this da will be in the coda. Now, what's going to happen here? What will happen here if I add a suffix e? If we add a suffix e, then I would instead expect to have, of course, three syllables, because we now have an additional syllable nucleus, and this da, which was put into the coda of that syllable, will instead be put into the onset of the following syllable. If we add a suffix mu instead, so da, bad, mu, then my expectation would be here, if we assume that the allowed onsets are the same as in English, then that alveolar stop is going to remain in the coda of the syllable, and the m will be part of the onset of the syllable built around the plus syllabic segment oo. All right. Theoretically, it would be possible to build a complex onset dmu instead. If we instead add a prefix o, then I don't think anything is going to change in terms of the original syllabification. Here, we will simply add another syllable built around that plus syllabic segment o. And if we add a syllable, a prefix il, likewise, I don't really expect any changes to the syllabification, the original syllabification of the stem dabad. Instead, most likely, we will just add a further syllable el, and in principle, it would be possible to make a complex onset leda, but that's less likely, and by rules of syllabification in English, is not likely to happen. So we see something of an asymmetry here, something of a difference in behavior between prefixation and suffixation. The prefixes that we've added generally didn't change the syllabic constituency of the original stem here, whereas adding some suffixes may have, in particular if the suffix just consists of another syllable nucleus here. The difference here is that because affixes that contain vowels are going to add other syllable nuclei, and generally the maximization of onsets is preferred, at least building simple onsets is going to be fine, then as we saw here with the prefix o, this da was not added to the coda of a syllable here, making syllable od a word with syllabic structure od, a, bad, but instead the da remained there because onset formation, we assume, applies before coda formation. Instead, here when we added a suffix e, the result was that the da at the end of this stem was instead put into the onset of that following syllable instead of being made into a coda consonant. All right. Now, another crucial aspect of understanding how syllabification can have effects across a language is understanding in what domains, in what bounding domains syllabification applies. Because sometimes in certain languages, syllabification can apply across larger boundaries, not just inside the morphosyntactic word, as we've been working here, assuming that it corresponds to a phonological word, but also across morphosyntactic word boundaries. That is, if processes of onset formation and coda formation are bounded in some way, then they might affect where the syllable boundaries are going to be affected. So for instance, if onset formation is stem bounded, that would mean that there are going to be necessarily syllable boundaries placed between a stem and any prefixes or affixes. All of the consonants of the stem are going to need to be placed into a syllables inside the stem. The crucial thing to say here is that if the domain of onset formation and coda formation corresponds to the stem, it means that the consonants and the following already existing syllables need to belong to the same domain. So in effect, adding information about the domain of some boundaries, the domain of onset and coda formation, will tell us whether or not segments that belong to other morphosyntactic words or different morphosyntactic parts can be placed into different syllables. If you recall from our first example with the word calling home, here we see clearly in English that syllabification is not stem bounded because this L, which belongs to the stem, is placed into a syllable with the segments of this inflectional suffix ing. If syllabification were stem bounded, if onset and coda formation were stem bounded in English, then when onset formation would apply, this I vowel here would look to its left, see the stem boundary here and say, well, there is an L which hasn't yet been placed into a syllable, but because there is the stem boundary between me, the vowel I, and this consonant la, I cannot put this la consonant into my onset. Instead, because onset formation is not stem bounded in English, the L can be happily associated to a syllable with that I forming onset. Let's now see an example of just this phenomenon from German involving a rule of glottal stop insertion. And the rule says that a glottal stop is inserted. We're using a simple version of this rule. It's in fact a bit more complex, and glottal stop insertion also depends upon stress. But for this example, we'll just assume a simple version, which says that a glottal stop is inserted preceding a vowel at the beginning of a syllable. So what we want to do now is to determine the bounding domain of syllabification in order to generate the correct surface form. So here we have we will ultimately have the output, das ist ein alter Ochs, and we can see here a number of glottal stops, which, when we compare this to our underlying representation with the following morphosyntactic words, das ist ein alter Ochs, trying hard not to pronounce the glottal stops here, we have a number of glottal stops being inserted. So if we apply our rules of syllable construction here, we'll start by, when we build up the syllables, let's ignore the morphosyntactic structure of morphosyntactic words and phrases in this entire utterance. We'll begin by building syllables around each of the vowels. A, I, the diphthong I, A, the schwa, and the vowel O of ox. So we have a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 syllables. Now, when it comes to onset formation, we can begin from the left and go to the right. So the second step, so here's the first step in our derivation, syllable assignment. When we proceed to the next step of onset formation, first the da will need to be incorporated here. And now here we have an interesting question. So this I can see that an S occurs to its left. These two words, these two morphosyntactic words, das and ist, are part of the same phonological phrase, we're assuming here. And notice, importantly at the end here, that the glottal stop is inserted before the vowel I in this case. Theoretically, it would be possible that this S would be placed into a syllable here to provide an onset. But clearly this hasn't happened, because if there were an S placed in the onset of the syllable built around the vowel I, then glottal stop insertion would not apply in that case. We would instead find something like das ist, rather than das ist with the glottal stop in that case. So this tells us that at this phase of onset formation, the S can't be inserted into the onset here. And similarly, the ta and the sa to the left of the diphthong I can't be placed into the onset of that syllable. Again, otherwise, the glottal stop that actually occurs there wouldn't be inserted. So we seem to see that all of these morphosyntactic words, ist, ein, alter, and ox, all remain without any consonants in their onset, even though there are consonants at the end of the following morphosyntactic words. This indicates to us that onset formation is word bounded. It cannot look outside the morphosyntactic word and take a consonant from a preceding morphosyntactic word to add it to the onset. And at this phase, then when coda formation applies, we have a lot of the only onsets that could have been added were in the adjective alta, this syllable. We have the ta to add there. Otherwise, no other onsets were added. Now, when coda formation applies, all of the remaining still unsyllabified segments will be placed into codas. So das ist, the nasal of ein, the L of alta, the rhotic of alta, and finally the ka and sa of ox. Finally then, glottal insertion is going to apply at the end of the derivation and provide an onset for all of the words that don't already have an onset. So in the words ist, ein, alta, and ox, those syllables are going to receive a glottal stop at their respective beginnings. Now, at the very end, there's also a further process that transforms the sequence here into an a. That has to do with processes affecting the uvular fricative in coda position, but we won't worry about that for now. Okay, now that we've seen this exercise showing us that in German that the process of onset formation is clearly bounded by the morphosyntactic word. Other consonants can't be grabbed, taken from across word boundaries. We can pause for a moment, and when we'll return, we can look at the domain of syllabification in Turkish to see a contrasting case.